My name is Michal, and what I'm about to tell you sounds impossible. I've been a park ranger for 10 years now, and before that I spent 8 years in the Navy. I've seen combat, I've dealt with dangerous wildlife, and I've rescued people from situations that would make most folks lose sleep for weeks. Nothing prepared me for what happened last October in the deep woods of northern Montana when I encountered Bigfoot. I'm not the type to believe in monsters or fairy tales. My job is based on facts, evidence, and keeping people safe in the wilderness. When hikers come to me with stories about strange sounds or mysterious footprints, I usually chalk it up to bears, elk, or just overactive imaginations. That all changed on October 12th when I encountered something that science says doesn't exist: a living, breathing Sasquatch. It started 3 weeks before my Bigfoot encounter. I was doing my regular patrol of the backcountry trails, checking for damaged signs and clearing fallen branches. The area I cover is about 40 square miles of dense forest, steep ridges, and hidden valleys that most visitors never see. It's rough terrain, but I know every trail, every creek, and every animal path like the back of my hand. Perfect Bigfoot habitat, though I didn't know it at the time. On September 19th, I found the first set of footprints near Blackwater Creek, about 12 miles from the nearest campground. At first glance, they looked like bear tracks, but something was off. They were too long, too narrow, and showed what looked like 5 distinct toe impressions. A bear's front paw is wide and shows claws extending well beyond the toes. These big footprints were different. I measured them with my ranger tape. 18 inches long, 7 inches wide at the ball with a clear heel impression. The stride length was massive, nearly 6 feet between steps. I've tracked black bears and grizzlies for years, and I've never seen anything like it. The depth of the impression suggested something incredibly heavy, probably over 800 pounds. Classic Sasquatch tracks, I now know. What made my skin crawl was how deliberate the Bigfoot tracks appeared. They didn't wander like an animal following scent trails or searching for food. Instead, they moved with purpose along a route that would provide maximum cover while still allowing rapid movement through the terrain. That's not animal behavior. That's tactical thinking. That's intelligent Bigfoot behavior. I took photos of the Sasquatch prints and made notes, thinking maybe it was a deformed bear or some kind of abnormal track formation. I reported it to my supervisor, but he just shrugged it off. "Wildlife does strange things sometimes," he said. "Maybe a bear with an injured paw was walking differently than usual." That night, I went home and researched everything I could find about unusual animal tracks and Bigfoot footprints. I compared my photos to bear, human, and even gorilla tracks. Nothing matched the Sasquatch prints I'd found. The proportions were all wrong: too long for a bear, too wide for a human. And the toe arrangement was unlike anything in the scientific literature except for reported Bigfoot tracks. Over the next week, I found more Sasquatch prints. They followed game trails through the densest parts of the forest, places where even experienced hikers rarely venture. The Bigfoot, whatever it was, seemed to know the terrain better than most animals. It avoided open areas and stuck to heavy cover, almost like it was deliberately trying to stay hidden. Typical Sasquatch behavior, according to researchers. But what really unsettled me was the pattern of the Bigfoot tracks. They appeared in clusters around water sources, game trails, and areas where hikers commonly camped. It was almost like the Sasquatch was conducting surveillance, learning human movement patterns and behavior. I found Bigfoot prints near 3 different backcountry campsites that had been occupied by visitors in the previous weeks. The tracks always approached from downwind, stayed in heavy cover, and never got closer than about 200 yards to human activity areas. That kind of systematic observation suggested the Sasquatch possessed intelligence far beyond what any known animal had. By the end of September, I started noticing changes in the local wildlife that Bigfoot researchers say are common signs of Sasquatch activity. During my morning patrols, I'd usually see deer feeding in the meadows, squirrels gathering nuts, and birds going about their normal routines. Suddenly, everything was different. The deer were skittish beyond anything I'd ever seen. They'd bolt at the slightest sound, even sounds they normally ignored, like my ATV engine or radio chatter. I found several deer carcasses that looked like they'd died from sheer panic. No wounds, no signs of predation, just dead animals that appeared to have run themselves to exhaustion fleeing from the Bigfoot. What made it worse was finding these carcasses in patterns. They weren't randomly scattered. They formed rough lines pointing away from specific areas of the forest, like the animals had been fleeing from the Sasquatch and died while trying to escape. The areas they were fleeing from always corresponded to places where I'd found the unusual Bigfoot tracks. The birds were acting strange too. Ravens and crows, normally bold and curious, were staying high in the treetops and avoiding the ground entirely in areas of Bigfoot activity. I noticed they'd gather in large flocks and make agitated calls whenever I approached certain sections of the forest where I'd been finding Sasquatch sign. It was like they were warning each other about the Bigfoot, but it was the smaller animals that really drove home how wrong everything had become. Squirrels, chipmunks, and other rodents had essentially vanished from large sections of the forest where the Bigfoot tracks were concentrated. These creatures are everywhere in healthy wilderness. You can't walk 50 feet without seeing or hearing them. But in the areas where the Sasquatch was active, there was nothing. It was like they'd all simply disappeared to avoid the Bigfoot. Even more unsettling was the silence in Bigfoot territory. Normally, the forest is full of sound. Insects buzzing, small animals rustling through leaves, birds calling to each other. But in certain areas, particularly along the ridgeline where I'd been finding the Sasquatch tracks, everything was dead quiet. It felt unnatural, like the whole ecosystem was holding its breath in the presence of the Bigfoot. On October 2nd, I encountered a black bear that was behaving unlike any bear I'd ever seen, and I now believe it had encountered the Sasquatch. It was a large male, probably 400 pounds. But when it saw me, it immediately climbed the nearest tree and refused to come down. Bears don't usually retreat from humans unless they're surprised or protecting cubs. This bear acted terrified, constantly looking over its shoulder toward the deeper forest, like the Bigfoot was pursuing it. I tried to approach the tree to get a better look at the bear, thinking maybe it was injured or sick. But as I got closer, it started making distress calls, not the normal sounds of an agitated bear, but genuine panic vocalizations. The bear was so frightened of whatever was out there, the Sasquatch, that it was shaking. Actually shaking while clinging to the tree trunk about 20 feet off the ground. That's when I noticed the scratches on the tree bark below where the bear was perched. Deep gouges in the wood, too high to have been made by any normal predator, and arranged in patterns that suggested something the Bigfoot had been trying to climb up after the bear. The scratches were fresh, probably made within the last day or two. I backed away from the tree and left the bear alone, but the image of that terrified 400-pound predator cowering in the branches haunted me for days. Whatever had put that kind of fear into an apex predator was something I didn't want to meet. I now know it was a Sasquatch. The Bigfoot vocalizations started on October 5th. I was camping overnight at a remote monitoring station about 20 miles from headquarters, checking water quality sensors and maintaining equipment. Around 2 a.m., I was awakened by a sound I'd never heard before. A sound I now know was Bigfoot communication. It started as a low rumble, almost like a diesel engine idling in the distance. But engines don't make sounds that rise and fall in pitch, and they don't echo through valleys the way this Sasquatch call did. The rumble grew louder and turned into something between a roar and a howl, deeper than any wolf, longer than any bear, and more powerful than anything I could identify. It was unmistakably a Bigfoot vocalization. The sound lasted about 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was absolute. No insects, no night birds, nothing. It was like every living thing in the forest had gone completely still after hearing the Sasquatch. But what made my blood run cold was what happened next. About 10 minutes after the first Bigfoot vocalization, I heard an answer. From a different direction, maybe 2 miles away, came a similar Sasquatch call, but with subtle variations in pitch and rhythm. It was unmistakably a response, a communication between two Bigfoot. Then a third Sasquatch voice joined in from yet another direction, and a fourth. Within minutes, I was listening to what sounded like a conversation conducted in deep, powerful Bigfoot vocalizations that carried for miles through the mountain air. The sounds had structure, patterns, almost like the Sasquatch were exchanging information. I grabbed my flashlight and .45 service pistol and checked the perimeter of my camp. I found nothing unusual, but the feeling of being watched by the Bigfoot was overwhelming. The worst part was realizing that the Sasquatch vocalizations had been coming from positions that would have allowed the creatures to observe my camp from multiple angles. The Bigfoot had me surrounded. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening for any repeat of the Sasquatch sounds. They never came, but I could feel something out there in the darkness. Every few minutes, I'd hear a branch snap or leaves rustle in a way that suggested large, careful movement through the forest. Bigfoot moving in the night. The next morning, I found more tracks around my campsite. Sasquatch prints circled the area at about a 100-yard radius, like something had been observing me while I slept. The Bigfoot prints were fresh, definitely made during the night while I was there. But what terrified me was the number of different track sizes. At least 4 different Sasquatch individuals had been watching me, ranging from prints that were 16 inches long to one set that measured over 20 inches. A whole group of Bigfoot had surrounded my camp. Over the following week, I heard the Bigfoot vocalizations 3 more times, always at night, always from different locations, but always that same deep, powerful Sasquatch sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground. I tried recording it with my phone, but the audio quality was too poor to capture the true depth and resonance of the Bigfoot calls. The pattern of the sounds suggested the Sasquatch were following established routes through the forest, possibly patrol paths or Bigfoot territory boundaries. I started mapping the locations where I heard the vocalizations and discovered they formed a rough perimeter around an area of about 10 square miles. The same area where I'd been finding the most Bigfoot tracks and where the wildlife behavior was most disturbed. Other rangers started reporting strange Sasquatch sounds too. Trail maintenance crews refused to work in certain areas, claiming they felt like they were being watched by something. 2 experienced wilderness guides canceled trips into the backcountry, saying their clients were too spooked by unexplained noises that sounded like Bigfoot to continue. But what really scared me was when I mentioned the vocalizations to my supervisor. His reaction was too controlled, too prepared. He told me to file a report about unusual wildlife activity, but specifically instructed me not to mention the sounds to other staff or visitors. When I asked why, he just said that unconfirmed reports of unusual animal activity, or Bigfoot, could cause unnecessary panic among park guests. That's when I realized this wasn't the first time someone had reported these Sasquatch sounds. October 12th started like any other day. I was assigned to check on a group of researchers who were studying old-growth trees in one of the most remote sections of my patrol area, deep in Bigfoot territory. They'd been out of radio contact for 2 days, which wasn't unusual given the terrain, but protocol required a welfare check. I loaded my ATV with extra water, emergency medical supplies, and survival gear, then headed up the old logging road that led closest to their research site. The road hasn't been maintained in decades, so the last 5 miles had to be covered on foot through some of the thickest forest in the region, prime Sasquatch habitat. The hike started normally enough. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, temperature in the mid-60 seconds, just enough breeze to keep the bugs away. I made good time on the established trail, covering the first 3 miles in under an hour. But as I got deeper into the forest, into Bigfoot country, that familiar, unsettling silence returned. By noon, I reached the area where the researchers should have been working. I found their base camp easily enough, 3 tents, a cooking area, and scientific equipment neatly arranged in a small clearing, but there was no sign of the team. The camp looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry, possibly because of a Bigfoot encounter. Personal belongings were scattered around, food was left out, attracting flies, and their expensive research equipment was just sitting unprotected. Most concerning was the condition of one tent, which had been partially collapsed with several guidelines snapped, possibly by the Sasquatch. I called out for the research team and got no response. I fired 3 shots into the air, a standard signal for emergency assistance, and waited. Nothing. That's when I found the Bigfoot tracks. They were everywhere around the camp. The same Sasquatch prints I'd been finding for weeks, far more than I'd seen at any previous location. The Bigfoot tracks crisscrossed the area like something had been pacing back and forth for hours. Some of the Sasquatch impressions were so deep they'd pressed through the forest floor into the clay beneath. Following the Bigfoot tracks away from camp, I noticed they led toward a steep ravine about 200 yards to the north. The Sasquatch prints were joined by what looked like drag marks in the dirt, as if something heavy had been pulled along the ground by the Bigfoot. My stomach dropped as I realized the implications. I radioed headquarters to report the situation and request backup, but the radio just crackled with static. The dense forest and steep terrain made communication difficult. Following protocol for a potential emergency, I should have marked my position and hiked back to get help. But if the research team was injured by the Bigfoot and in need of immediate assistance, Every minute could matter. I decided to follow the Sasquatch tracks for a short distance to see if I could locate the missing researchers. The trail led down into the ravine, which was choked with deadfall and thick undergrowth. The Bigfoot tracks were harder to follow on the rocky ground, but I could still see disturbed vegetation and occasional clear Sasquatch prints in patches of soft earth. About halfway down the ravine, I found pieces of torn fabric caught on branches. The material was the same color as the jackets the research team had been wearing. A few yards further, I discovered a broken GPS unit and a damaged backpack with claw marks raked across the fabric. The evidence was pointing toward a Bigfoot attack, but I couldn't be certain. The Sasquatch tracks still didn't match any bear I'd ever seen, and bears typically don't drag their prey. They feed where they kill or cache food nearby. This looked like the Bigfoot had deliberately carried the researchers away from their camp. As I worked my way deeper into the ravine, following the Sasquatch trail, the feeling of being watched by the Bigfoot grew stronger. Several times I stopped and scanned the surrounding forest, but I couldn't see anything unusual. Still, every instinct I'd developed during 8 years of military service was telling me I was in danger from the Sasquatch. I was about a mile from the research camp when I heard movement ahead of me. At first, it sounded like a large animal pushing through heavy brush, but the rhythm was wrong. It was too steady, too purposeful. It sounded like Bigfoot footsteps. I drew my pistol and moved forward cautiously, using trees for cover. The sound was coming from a small clearing about 50 yards ahead, just beyond a thick stand of pine trees. I could hear what sounded like heavy breathing and occasional low grunts. Sasquatch sounds. Moving as quietly as possible, I worked my way to the edge of the clearing and peered around a large Douglas fir. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. It was my first clear view of a living Bigfoot. In the center of the clearing stood the largest living creature I've ever encountered. The Bigfoot was massive, easily 9 feet tall and built like a linebacker. Its entire body was covered in dark brown hair, thick and coarse, like a bear's winter coat. The Sasquatch was standing upright on 2 legs, but its proportions were all wrong for a human. Its arms hung nearly to its knees, its shoulders were impossibly broad, and its head was enormous. This was a real, living Bigfoot. The creature was holding something in its hands, turning it over and examining it closely. As my eyes adjusted, I realized the Bigfoot was manipulating a piece of equipment from the research camp, one of their expensive GPS units. The Sasquatch was handling the device with surprising delicacy, almost like it was trying to figure out how it worked. For several minutes, I just watched the Bigfoot in stunned silence. The Sasquatch moved with intelligence and purpose, not like a mindless animal. It would examine the GPS unit, set it down, pick up other objects from a pile I hadn't noticed before, then return to the GPS. The Bigfoot was clearly capable of complex thought and problem solving. Then the wind shifted and I realized my mistake. The Bigfoot's head snapped up immediately, and the Sasquatch turned in my direction. Even from 50 yards away, I could see its eyes, intelligent, alert, and fixed directly on my position. The Bigfoot had caught my scent. For a few seconds, we just stared at each other. The Sasquatch's face was like a cross between a human and an ape, but far more primitive than either. Its brow was heavy and pronounced, its jaw massive, and its nose flat and wide. But those Bigfoot eyes, those eyes showed an intelligence that was unmistakably aware. Then the Bigfoot stood up to its full height and roared. The Sasquatch sound was even more terrifying up close than it had been from a distance. It was a challenge, a warning, and a display of raw Bigfoot power, all rolled into one. The roar echoed off the canyon walls and seemed to shake the ground beneath my feet. I did the only thing my military training had taught me to do when facing an immediate threat from a charging Bigfoot. I raised my weapon and fired at the Sasquatch. My first shot hit the Bigfoot center mass, just below the right shoulder. At that range, with a .45 caliber hollow point, it should have dropped anything that walked on this planet. Instead, the Sasquatch staggered back a step, looked down at the wound, then looked back at me with what I can only describe as annoyance. The Bigfoot started moving toward me. I fired again at the Sasquatch, this time aiming for the head. The shot went high and to the left, probably because my hands were shaking so badly. The Bigfoot broke into a run, covering the 50 yards between us faster than seemed possible for something that size. I got off 3 more shots as the Sasquatch charged. at least one of which I'm certain hit the Bigfoot in the chest. None of them slowed the creature down. When the Bigfoot was about 20 feet away, I dove to the side and rolled behind a fallen log. The Sasquatch ran past me, then turned and started looking around, trying to figure out where I'd gone. I could hear the Bigfoot breathing heavily, and I could smell it, a musky animal odor mixed with something else I couldn't identify. From my hiding spot, I could see the wounds where my bullets had hit the Sasquatch. There was blood, but not nearly as much as there should have been. The Bigfoot was hurt, but it was far from incapacitated. I stayed hidden behind the log for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. The Sasquatch paced back and forth, occasionally letting out low grunts and sniffing the air. The Bigfoot knew I was close, but it couldn't pinpoint my exact location. Finally, the Sasquatch seemed to lose interest. It walked back to the center of the clearing, gathered up the items it had been examining, and disappeared into the forest, moving north. The Bigfoot was gone. I waited another 30 minutes before I dared to move. Once I was sure the Sasquatch was gone, I examined the clearing where the Bigfoot encounter had taken place. The evidence of what had happened was overwhelming. The creature's footprints were everywhere, Bigfoot tracks pressed deep into the soft earth. I took measurements and photos of the clearest Sasquatch prints. The tracks matched the ones I'd been finding for weeks. But these were even more detailed. I could see individual toe prints, the texture of the sole, even what looked like hair imprints around the edges of the Bigfoot print. I found several spots where my bullets had hit trees after passing through or past the Bigfoot. One bullet had struck a pine tree about 6 feet off the ground, right at the Sasquatch's chest level. The bullet had mushroomed on impact, indicating it had hit something solid before reaching the tree. Most importantly, I found Bigfoot blood. Dark red drops led away from the clearing in the direction the Sasquatch had gone. I collected samples in evidence bags, though I wasn't sure what I was going to do with Bigfoot DNA. I also found more equipment from the research team scattered around the clearing. GPS units, sample containers, and pieces of clothing were arranged in several piles, almost like the Bigfoot had been sorting through them. But I found no sign of the researchers themselves. The Sasquatch had taken them somewhere else. I knew I had to get out of the forest immediately. The Bigfoot was wounded and probably angry, and I had no idea if there were other Sasquatch in the area. My radio still wasn't working, and I was miles from the nearest help. I started hiking back toward my ATV as fast as the terrain would allow. Every shadow looked like a potential Bigfoot. Every sound made me jump. I kept my pistol drawn and tried to stay in areas with good visibility, avoiding the thick undergrowth where a Sasquatch could hide. About halfway back to the research camp, I heard the Bigfoot vocalizations again, the same deep, rumbling Sasquatch calls I'd been hearing for weeks, but this time they seemed to be coming from multiple directions. It sounded like the Bigfoot were communicating with each other, possibly coordinating some kind of response to my presence. The Sasquatch were talking about me. But what made my blood freeze was when I started hearing other sounds mixed in with the Bigfoot vocalizations. Sounds that were almost like human voices, but distorted and wrong. At first, I thought it might be the missing researchers calling for help, but the voices didn't sound quite right. They were too deep, too resonant, like the Sasquatch was trying to mimic human speech without fully understanding how it worked. I picked up the pace, practically jogging when the terrain allowed it. My military conditioning served me well. Despite being 15 years older than when I left the Navy, I was still in good enough shape to maintain a fast pace for several miles while fleeing from the Bigfoot. When I reached the research camp, I grabbed some water and a flashlight from the abandoned supplies and continued toward my ATV. I didn't stop to investigate the camp further or look for additional clues about what the Sasquatch had done to the researchers. My only priority was getting back to civilization alive and away from the Bigfoot. The hike back to my ATV took 2 hours of hard walking. Several times I heard sounds of Bigfoot movement in the forest around me, but I never saw the Sasquatch. Whether the creatures were following me or I was just paranoid, I couldn't tell. About a mile from my ATV, I had to stop and rest. I was exhausted, dehydrated, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my weapon. That's when I heard sounds that nearly broke me, voices calling from somewhere in the forest behind me, but they weren't quite right. The words were human, but the tone and pitch were off, like the Bigfoot was imitating sounds it had heard but didn't understand. The Sasquatch calls seemed designed to draw me back into the woods. I forced myself to keep moving toward my ATV, even as the strange Bigfoot vocalizations continued from the forest. They followed me for nearly a mile, the Sasquatch always staying just out of sight in the thick forest. Sometimes, the Bigfoot sounded close enough to touch. Other times, the Sasquatch seemed to come from much further away. But the calls never stopped. The Bigfoot never gave up trying to draw me back into the woods. When I finally reached my ATV, I'd never been so happy to see a piece of machinery in my life. I fired it up and drove back down the logging road as fast as I dared, not stopping until I reached the main highway. Even then, I didn't feel safe. I kept checking my rearview mirrors, expecting to see a Bigfoot pursuing me down the mountain road. The strange Sasquatch calls had stopped when I reached the ATV, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the Bigfoot was still watching me. I reported the Bigfoot incident immediately upon returning to headquarters. My supervisor listened to my account with increasing skepticism, especially when I got to the part about shooting a 9-foot Sasquatch that shrugged off multiple .45 caliber rounds. A search and rescue team was dispatched the next morning to look for the missing researchers and investigate the Bigfoot encounter. I guided them to the campsite in the clearing where I'd encountered the Sasquatch. The SAR team found all the evidence I described, the abandoned camp, the scattered equipment, and the massive Bigfoot footprints, but they interpreted everything differently than I had. The team leader, a veteran ranger with 25 years of experience, concluded that the researchers had been attacked by a large bear, not a Bigfoot. The scattered equipment and abandoned camp were consistent with people fleeing a bear encounter, he said. The drag marks I'd found could have been made by the bear moving the bodies. The footprints were more difficult to explain. The SAR team measured them and confirmed my earlier findings, 18 inches long, 7 inches wide, with clear toe impressions. But they theorized that the Bigfoot tracks might have been made by a bear walking upright, or possibly by multiple overlapping bear tracks that had been distorted by rain and time. They refused to acknowledge these were Sasquatch prints. They found the Bigfoot blood samples I'd collected, but when they were sent to the state lab for analysis, the results came back as inconclusive. The DNA was degraded and contaminated, making it impossible to identify whether it was from a Bigfoot or some other source. Most frustrating was the fact that my bullet impacts on the trees had somehow disappeared. When the investigative team visited the clearing, they found no evidence of gunfire. The trees I remembered shooting during the Sasquatch encounter showed no bullet holes, no damage, nothing. It was like the Bigfoot encounter had never happened. The official report concluded that the research team had been killed by a large bear, possibly a grizzly that had wandered into the area from Canada, not by a Bigfoot. Their bodies were never recovered, which wasn't unusual in such dense forest where scavengers could quickly remove all traces of remains. I was cleared of any wrongdoing, but my account of the Sasquatch encounter was dismissed as a stress-induced hallucination brought on by the trauma of discovering the attack site. My supervisor recommended counseling and suggested I take some time off to recover from the incident. The Bigfoot, they insisted, didn't exist. Over the following weeks, I began to suspect that there was more to the official response to my Bigfoot encounter than I'd initially realized. My incident report about shooting the Sasquatch was classified at a level that seemed excessive for a simple bear attack. When I asked to review the file about the Bigfoot incident, I was told it was being handled by federal wildlife authorities and was no longer accessible to local personnel. The search for the missing researchers was called off after only 5 days, which seemed premature given the resources typically devoted to missing person cases, especially when Bigfoot might be involved. When family members of the researchers tried to organize private search efforts to find any trace of the victims or evidence of Bigfoot, they were discouraged by park officials who cited safety concerns and harsh weather conditions. Most telling was the response of other park employees who had heard about my Bigfoot encounter. Several rangers approached me privately to share their own experiences with unexplained sounds, unusual Sasquatch tracks, and wildlife behavior that didn't match known animal patterns, but none of them were willing to go on record with their Bigfoot accounts. One veteran ranger told me that similar Sasquatch incidents had been occurring for decades, but they were always explained away as bear attacks, hoaxes, or misidentifications. He suggested that there was an unofficial policy of suppressing Bigfoot reports that might damage the park's reputation or reduce tourism revenue. I started researching historical accounts of similar Bigfoot encounters in the region. What I found was disturbing. Going back over 50 years, there were dozens of reports of missing hikers, unexplained sounds, and sightings of large, upright Sasquatch creatures in the forests of northern Montana. In every case, the official explanation involved known wildlife or human error, never Bigfoot. But the pattern was too consistent to ignore. The locations where Sasquatch incidents occurred formed a rough Bigfoot territory covering several hundred square miles of remote forest. The timing of Bigfoot encounters followed seasonal patterns that suggested migration or territory-based behavior, and the physical descriptions of the creatures were remarkably consistent across decades of independent Sasquatch reports. I returned to duty after 2 weeks of administrative leave, but my effectiveness as a ranger was severely compromised by the Bigfoot trauma. I found it difficult to patrol alone in remote areas, especially at night. Every sound made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched by Bigfoot whenever I entered the deep forest. My relationship with other park personnel became strained over the Sasquatch incident. Some colleagues were sympathetic and believed my Bigfoot account, but others clearly thought I'd suffered some kind of breakdown. My supervisor assigned me to duties that kept me closer to headquarters and away from the backcountry where the Bigfoot encounter had occurred. The worst part was the knowledge that the research team had died because of my failure to act sooner on the Bigfoot evidence. If I'd taken the initial Sasquatch signs more seriously, if I'd insisted on backup before investigating the abandoned camp, if I'd been better prepared for encountering a Bigfoot, maybe they'd still be alive. I've struggled with survivor's guilt and post-traumatic stress from the Sasquatch encounter. The nightmares about the Bigfoot started about a month after the incident and haven't stopped. I dream about that clearing, about the Bigfoot examining the research equipment, about the intelligence in the Sasquatch's eyes when it looked at me. Most disturbing are the dreams where I don't escape from the Bigfoot, where the Sasquatch catches me and I wake up screaming. 6 months after my Bigfoot encounter, I was contacted by a researcher from a university in Oregon. He had heard about the Sasquatch incident through unofficial channels and wanted to interview me for a study he was conducting on unexplained wildlife encounters, specifically Bigfoot sightings in remote areas. The researcher, who asked to remain anonymous, told me that my Bigfoot experience was part of a much larger pattern of similar Sasquatch encounters across the Pacific Northwest and northern Rocky Mountains. He documented over 200 Bigfoot cases in the past 20 years involving credible witnesses, law enforcement officers, military personnel, scientists, and experienced outdoorsmen who'd encountered Sasquatch. According to his research, the Bigfoot I'd encountered was part of a relict population of unknown primate Sasquatch that had survived in the most remote wilderness areas of North America. Their intelligence and elusive nature had allowed the Bigfoot to remain hidden from mainstream science, but increasing human encroachment into Sasquatch territory was leading to more frequent Bigfoot encounters. The researcher shared photos and plaster casts of footprints from other Bigfoot locations that were virtually identical to the Sasquatch prints I'd found. He also played audio recordings of vocalizations that matched the Bigfoot sounds I'd been hearing in the weeks before my Sasquatch encounter. The evidence was compelling, but he warned me that publishing any of it would likely end his academic career. Scientists who study Bigfoot aren't taken seriously. He told me that there were government agencies aware of Bigfoot's existence, but they were committed to maintaining secrecy about Sasquatch to prevent public panic and protect the animals from exploitation. Witnesses who went public with their Bigfoot accounts typically faced ridicule, career damage, and sometimes more serious consequences for talking about Sasquatch. I've kept quiet about my Bigfoot encounter for over a year now, but the weight of the Sasquatch secret has become unbearable. I know what I saw in that clearing, and I know that what I shot was not a bear or any other known animal. It was a Bigfoot. It was a Sasquatch. It was something that science says doesn't exist. But I have the scars, both physical and psychological, to prove the Bigfoot encounter happened. The creatures are real. Bigfoot exists. Sasquatch is intelligent. They're dangerous when threatened, and they're living in the remote wilderness areas that most people never see. The Bigfoot have learned to avoid human contact, but as we continue to encroach on Sasquatch territory, encounters are becoming more frequent. I don't know how many Bigfoot there are or exactly what Sasquatch is biologically, but I know they're not just mindless animals. The way that Bigfoot examined the research equipment, the way the Sasquatch coordinated with others of its kind, the intelligence in the Bigfoot's eyes, when it looked at me, these are thinking beings with their own culture and society. The missing research team was never found, and I suspect they never will be. Whatever happened to them in that forest after the Bigfoot took them, their disappearance has been covered up by people who have decided that the truth about Sasquatch is too dangerous for the public to know. I've submitted my resignation from the Park Service. I can't continue working in an environment where I'm expected to pretend that my Bigfoot encounter never happened. The nightmares about the Sasquatch have gotten worse, and I can't risk being responsible for other people's safety when I know there are threats in the forest. Bigfoot threats that we're not allowed to acknowledge. I'm sharing this Bigfoot account because people have a right to know what's out there. If you're planning to hike or camp in remote wilderness areas, especially in the Pacific Northwest or northern Rocky Mountains, you need to be aware that you might encounter Bigfoot. You might come face to face with a Sasquatch. The creatures seem to avoid human contact when possible, but Bigfoot will defend themselves if threatened. Sasquatch are incredibly strong, surprisingly intelligent, and apparently capable of coordinating their activities with other Bigfoot. Standard precautions for dealing with known wildlife, making noise, storing food properly, carrying bear spray may not be adequate protection against Bigfoot. If you encounter Sasquatch tracks, sounds, or other signs that don't match known wildlife, take them seriously as evidence of Bigfoot activity. If animals in an area are acting unusually frightened or aggressive, it might be because of Sasquatch presence. Consider leaving immediately. And if you see a Bigfoot, if you encounter a Sasquatch, don't do what I did. Don't try to confront it or prove its existence. Just get away as quickly and quietly as possible from the Bigfoot. I've lost my career, my peace of mind, and my faith in the institutions I once trusted because of my Bigfoot encounter. But I've gained something too, the knowledge that there are still mysteries in this world. Still unknown creatures like Bigfoot living in the shadows of our civilization. Whether that knowledge about Sasquatch is worth the price I've paid, I'm not sure. But I know that what I encountered in that Montana forest was real Bigfoot. And I know that others will encounter Sasquatch too. When they do, I hope they're better prepared for Bigfoot than I was. And I hope they have better luck getting people to believe their Sasquatch story. The truth about Bigfoot is out there, quite literally. And someday, whether the government wants it to happen or not, the world is going to have to face the reality that we're not alone on this planet, that Bigfoot is real, that Sasquatch exists.